Merci beaucoup. Beaucoup. Shukran. Je m'excuse pour le besoin de parler en anglais, but I will if you need translation. I'd like to thank the organizers and sponsors of this conference, and Retta in particular, for inviting me to be here and enabling me to be a speaker with so many other illustrious speakers. And as mentioned, my topic relates to elections and the question of how they can enhance engagement and credibility. And much of what I'll mention in my remarks is based on NDI's 15 years of working in Morocco with political actors both inside and outside of government, and more specifically related to our observation of elections here in Morocco in both 2007 and most recently in 2011. And by way of background, for the 2011 elections, NDI fielded 41 accredited observers from 21 countries. We visited 200 polling stations across 31 different electoral districts in the country. And among these 41 were 10 long-term observers who were here between October and remained into early December to observe the post-election developments. And that observation mission built on a pre-election assessment held in October 2011, as well as, quite frankly, building from NDI's 25 years of observing elections in more than 200 countries. NDI conducted its observation in accordance with Moroccan law, as well as the Declaration of Principles for International Election Observation, which is endorsed by more than 39 multilateral and non-governmental organizations around the world. A final report of the findings will be forthcoming, based in part on the preliminary statement released by the Institute the day after the election, which many of you may have seen. And so I offer these thoughts and recommendations in the spirit of international cooperation and in an effort to try and strengthen democratic practices here to enable citizens' voices to be better heard in the decision-making process, and to hope that elections can continue to improve. The legislative elections in Morocco on November 25th were touted and spoken of as a necessary component of the overall reform in the country. And that began, as you know, with the formation of the Constitutional Revision Committee in March of 2011. And I can say that undeniably, Election Day transpired peacefully, and voting was administered in a procedurally sound and transparent manner. It did have its flaws, but overall the process allowed voters voters who chose to show up, it allowed them to cast their ballots without fear that it was being tampered with or that there were systematic procedural violations. And this has been a positive trend in Morocco during elections related to the technical operations of elections. However, as the Moroccan people know, and they've demonstrated that through their electoral behavior since 2007, and during research and debates conducted by NDI and other organizations, people have noted that elections are much more than merely the day of the vote. And by their very nature, they transcend technical questions to be about very big political issues. They are a political marker by which the people can express their satisfaction or their dissatisfaction with the political process, the responsiveness of political actors, and the accountability of decision makers. How people choose to participate can take a variety of forms, as it did in Morocco. Given the political context of 2011, the November elections came to represent an important test of the public confidence in the integrity of Morocco's political reform and governing institutions. Now, the political temperature has obviously calmed since that time, and even as recently as last month, when NDI was conducting qualitative research with young people on their attitudes towards the elections and the new government, the public recognize that this takes time and it requires patience following the elections. However, I would suggest that the Moroccan authorities need to be careful not to think that the electoral process, as a measure of public sentiment, can continue without some deep reflection on the broader political framework, the rules of the game, and the public's actual perception of the process. Many of the fundamental challenges that we saw in 2011 and continue to see were raised before in 2007. Failing to address those may have foreshadowed what came to follow once it was energized by the so-called Arab Spring. And while there are procedural improvements that have resulted in an outcome that is more reflective of Moroccans' wishes than in previous elections, the limited voter participation, the calls for boycotts, and the high proportion of protest votes, which I'll talk about, indicate that political reforms to date have not yet satisfied citizens' demands. This shouldn't be interpreted that the elections themselves were bad or that Moroccan citizens are not engaged politically. Rather, they are not engaged in the formal process as it currently exists. They desire further and deeper political reform. At a reported 45.4%, voter turnout was higher than it was in 2007 in relative terms, which the authorities quickly pointed to as an indication of support for the reform process. However, revisions to the voters' register seems to have contributed to that increase. The number of registered voters actually decreased by approximately 2 million people from 2007, and this is despite the fact that the total population since that time went up and the voting age was lowered from 21 to 18. Moreover, an estimated 6 million eligible citizens, about 37% of the eligible population, remain unregistered. And as I'll discuss, the rate of invalid ballots, which are blank or mismarked or purposely defaced ballots, seems to have increased significantly since 2007. Anytime blank or invalid ballot rates are in the double digits, as they have been since 2007, it's considered out of the ordinary. And that has persisted here. In fact, in November, NDI observers witnessed firsthand invalid ballot rates that averaged 20% across the country. And unofficial national data collected independently and available through a website, actionpublique.ma, placed the average at over 25%. The high proportion of intentionally invalidated ballots, and I saw large numbers of these myself while out observing, was particularly concerning. Written messages such as "no, no, no" were evidence of citizens' frustration, not just with the candidates, but with the overall process. It showed frustration, apathy, and a lack of confidence. So in the end, the number of valid ballots cast remains about the same as it was in 2007. There was no windfall in increased participation, and I think that's important in terms of reflecting on where has democratization gone since the new Constitution. Now, much of this may have stemmed from the fact, and we saw this in pre-election focus groups, that many people felt the elections were business as usual. There were some novelties in the new electoral code: legal framework for observation, stricter campaign financing laws, limited guarantees on women's representation, the use of the national identity card for voting, redistricting along administrative boundaries. Those were new. But fundamentally, on the whole, there were very few changes to the overarching political electoral framework. And several issues beyond the voter registration that I just pointed to are significant in terms on how well the system is accountable to public will, which, as we know, was one of the central mantras of the demonstrations in 2011, and not just in Morocco but across the region, the need for accountability and respect for the public will. One of these was the electoral system. It is a proportional representation with largest remainder system, which might be challenged to translate. But it is very hard for candidates and political parties to understand, let alone citizens. And what it does is it fractures the vote. It is usually used in countries that are emerging from conflict, where they need to find a broad way of including many voices to get past violence. And the problem is that this divisive nature reduces more aggressive competition among parties because it reduces the value of winning. It creates large, sometimes incoherent coalitions, and so one doesn't strive to win, one competes just to have enough to be a part of the coalition. On top of this, the complexity of how votes are allocated and the fact that it actually produces results, as we saw in 2007, it often produces results that are other than what is expected, can lead to suspicion among the public and political actors, even if there wasn't foul play. Number two, while the electoral district boundaries were adjusted ahead of the 2011 elections, redistricting was not carried out in any systematic manner. And in fact, population figures don't even exist for all of the new districts. And so the divergence of representation, the value of a representative in their seat, varies across the country and remains outside of the international standards put forward by the Venice Commission. So as one example among many, a seat from Bulman in the Fez-Bulman region is worth 29,000 voters. A seat in Sefru, which is not that far away in the same region, is worth 42,000 voters, a variation of 31%. So as a voter, my vote is worth less than others in a different district. Across districts, it can be even more serious. For example, Bouleman, with that 29,000 compared to Sidi Bernousi in Grand Casablanca, Sidi Bernousi has a seat is worth 68,000 votes. So that creates a variation of 58% in terms of the value of a seat. Finally, I would mention as one of these key issues, although parties are being encouraged to do more to build confidence among voters, we all know that parties have very little faith among the voting public. The candidate and campaign regulations that are put in place continue to become more and more restrictive. Campaign rules provide for a very short 13-day campaign period, which was reduced from 15 days in the past. And candidate registration takes place only 1 week before the campaign begins. In fact, the cutoff for submitting your candidacy is only 12 hours before the campaign begins. So what this does is it means that candidates and parties have not built the support and the public awareness and have a very short period to be able to do that, which means they don't have an incentive to build as much of a program. All of these points have been raised by the past by various actors, political parties, civil society, domestic monitors, international observers. And while they may seem technical by their very nature, they are extremely political because they define the rules of the game and determine if the playing field is level, which is at the heart of what I think the reform process was about. The decision to change them, and maybe even more, the willingness to have an open debate and an honest debate about these things is really based on the amount of real political will that is available. And because of that, it will be the decision to address electoral issues will be a demonstration to the public over the government's willingness to really engage in real reform. This is the fundamental issue about the 2011 elections from our perspective. It's less about who did or didn't win or who won how many seats. It's more about whether people feel the electoral process was significantly tied to reform, because elections are one of the most visible elements that people have for the sense of reform. And perhaps more telling than the preparations, or perhaps more telling for all of us in this regard than the technical aspects, were the preparations. Obviously, the elections came 1 year earlier than they were originally scheduled for, and people were still very much in the mentality of the referendum and the July reform process. And that meant that there was very little time to make the necessary revisions to the underlying organizational laws. I think the public understands that, but what they saw was a process that unfolded that reminded them that things were going to stay the same. The Ministry of Interior presented a hard copy of the draft laws to political party leaders only and made that available to them for only a few days before asking for feedback. Unfortunately, in a first test of whether Parliament and parties would really step forward to exert themselves, There were very few changes made to the electoral framework by legislators or proposed by parties. Most parties, in fairness, were unable to move so quickly to organize internal debate, let alone have consultations with constituents. Neither the government nor Parliament had sponsored public hearings, which meant civil society, who had many opinions on this, had very, very few opportunities to share their views. And so, and during the voting, as we all know, a significant number of parliamentarians were absent when these laws were passed. So, in essence, even if the public isn't able to follow all of the details of the legislative process or legal elements, they had the feeling that things were going to be the same. And I would argue that perception, in the case of the past year, is at least as important as the details. Despite these deficits and challenges, I'm an optimist by nature, but I would say that there are opportunities here to allow elections to add credibility to the reform process. So if Election Day is being used as a measure of public confidence, there can be some changes to the regulatory framework that can instill greater appreciation among the public and build goodwill. And sometimes it's those little things that matter in building goodwill to address some of the bigger, deeper issues. As a simple example, the Ministry of Interior has still not released detailed election results.
Never.
Including the invalid ballot rates and vote counts for parties across the country or even by region. Now, obviously, the country has moved on with the formation of the government and a finance law and all these things, so that those details are not going to matter as much in disputes. However, they're a sign of the willingness of the ministry to turn the page and take a new approach. We know that the ministry has the capacity because in 2007 and 2009, such information was provided within a week of election days. So it's more a question among the people of where is the commitment of the government to change, and where is the commitment of political elites in protecting public interest. It's not so much about the details, it's about where this fits into the process. Are the elites demanding this information to show the public that they're concerned about public interest? So a few other areas to wrap up where I think that there are some steps that could be taken. Some are big, some are smaller, that could promote this confidence. Ultimately, from the big, I would say the process of how these deliberations happen is as important. And therefore, I would suggest that there needs to be continued public dialogue. It needs to include representatives from across the spectrum, from the palace, from the government, from political parties, the press, academia, civil society, and in fact, the Moroccan people, to have an opportunity to talk about some of these questions. At a minimum, these discussions should at least be transparent and the decisions publicized so that people can understand and gain more trust in the process and the government. Among these discussions needs to be a debate about the electoral system, as I mentioned, and the electoral map. Whether there's a more constructive electoral system that addresses Morocco's governance priorities right now, and so that there's a demographic balance within electoral districts. And I want to say there are no right or wrong answers here, and I'm not proposing one over the other. The point is that there should be a dialogue and a discussion to determine these, and it should be a deliberative, transparent process. The Moroccan government should explore the feasibility of an independent election commission. These commissions are becoming more and more common in places where there's a need to build confidence around the world. And empowering such a body as a neutral actor could go a long way to address public skepticism over administration. As I mentioned, even though the elections were administered from our perspective neutrally, the question isn't so much what we think, it's what the Moroccan public thinks. The Moroccan government might amend the electoral code to allow political parties and citizens to audit the voter list, have access to that before the elections, to build confidence that who is going to vote are real people. This is a common feature across not only the country but the region now, and I think Morocco needs to consider this in terms of international standards. Using the national identification card for voting was very positive, perhaps using that system as a way for a passive registration process is an important way to encourage and make it easier for Moroccans to go vote. Ministry of Interior officials said to us they couldn't do that because that would be forcing people to go to vote. But enabling people to go to vote, making it easier for them because they register more easily, is not the same as making them go to vote. So this is a very common feature. Another small item, they might consider the practice of burning valid ballots the moment that the count ends. Now, this is a minor issue for some. It's intended to discourage vote rigging at later, that more ballots are added. But quite frankly, it sends the image to the people that there's manipulation going on, even if there isn't. And France is often referred to as the model for this practice, but it's important to note that France uses a very different ballot system, and the French people have confidence in the system so that they're comfortable with that. I mean, we saw over 80% turnout for the last elections. Contrast that with the turnout here, and we see the levels of confidence. And finally, I would consider extending the campaign period and the regulations around campaigning so that parties are actually encouraged to have platforms and do more about educating the public about elections, government, policies, rather than just trying to get people to go vote on election day for whomever. And there would be more effort then by parties, and parties play an important role in this. It's not just the authorities. Parties need to be there, mobilizing people, doing outreach regularly and consistently to make sure that people are aware of their rights, are aware of why they should vote, and how parties are different. So, in conclusion, if municipal and regional elections go forward this year as are currently speculated, many of these larger points may not be able to be addressed quickly. However, a number of the small points could be addressed in a good faith effort, and they wouldn't be too difficult, and they could happen quite quickly. And so I would suggest it's obvious, I think it would be greatly appreciated by citizens. It's obvious that a significant segment of the population believes in the ballot box and in elections as an important avenue. But they need more assurances that going to the ballot box is not a futile exercise, that it actually results in something meaningful. The amount of time that it took those 28% of voters to go register, find their polling station, show up on the day of the vote, and actually cast a ballot, even if it was blank or they had written something on it, shows that they are seeking some way to channel their interests and communicate their political views, but they just don't believe that the system has caught up yet for that. As one citizen wrote on a ballot that one of our observers saw, "There is no water in Morocco, and we are thirsty." And so when it comes to elections, people understand that there are challenges, but they're thirsty, and they want to at least see that wells are being dug, even if the water isn't being delivered yet. Thank you very much.